Research ethics. So doing research often involves a lot of power in a sense. So you're asking people to give their time, and you're also setting up experiments in which people are being vulnerable with you. So there has been a whole structure of regulation that has developed to ensure that research is done in a way that is morally correct and that is allowing people to ensure that they're being protected throughout the research process. And so ethics is relating to moral principles. So we're talking about the rights and wrongs of research. And there's not any like universal laws on this. A lot of this is developed by the professionals within research and created through norms and standards. And it's important to have these because then it allows for people who want to participate in research to build a sense of trust and to want to engage with research, because historically, as we'll talk about more in this lecture, there's been a lot of instances in which researchers have caused harm and have not done research in a way that is ethical. So that creates a stigma and makes it more difficult for people to want to engage in research. And then that makes it a lot more difficult for us to say this is truth, because we want to make sure that we have participants across a broad span of the population. So if there are people who are more likely to not want to engage in research, that sort of undermines our ability to generalize. So a key component of ensuring that there's ethical research is anonymity and confidentiality. So we make sure that our participants, in some instances, are not known to us. Like, for example, when I sent you all the survey, I was making sure that it was anonymous, and I did that intentionally. So the perspectives that you had coming into the course would not influence how I see your academic work as I look at it. And so I intentionally did that to make sure that I wasn't being influenced by what you all were disclosing to me. And so sometimes we'll do this in research too. We'll, as researchers, blind ourselves to what participants say what, or what, attaching names to the data we collect from them. And sometimes this happens through like a technological medium, like a computer, or it happens through how we set up the design of our experiment. And so there are different ways to do this, but it's important to have anonymity and at the very least to have some sense of confidentiality. So with confidentiality, the researcher can know who is saying what, but the public will not. So confidentiality is usually used a lot in instances where there's qualitative methods. So you're actively engaging with people, so you can't not know who they are or how they're acting, but you can ensure that when you write your book or when you write your article that says what your findings are, you're not disclosing their names. So we often use pseudonyms, like fake names, in place of people's real names, so there's no backlash. And especially in criminal justice, where we're engaging with people who maybe are doing delinquent things or things that are not, that they could get some pushback on, we want to make sure that we're maintaining confidentiality. So generally, research should have no harm to participants. There should be no physical or emotional adverse harm that people would have. And sometimes this is difficult to do, especially when we're studying crime and violence, because we can't necessarily control that. And especially when we're dealing with people who have experienced trauma, even bringing up those issues may cause them severe psychological harm. So sometimes we'll put in place making sure that they have services such as therapy as they go through the project, or making sure that we provide them like a helpline in case they do need to talk to someone. And your book provides an example of a study by Perón, and he was studying drug use in New York Dance Club. So in this particular instance, there's issues with, okay, so if someone is using drugs and they're actually harming themselves or getting to a point of overdose, then there's difficulty in, okay, I'm a researcher and I'm supposed to be just observing, but I have an obligation also as a human being to help this person. And so generally there are institutional review boards that will help you set up your design so you're not in instances like that. But then it becomes difficult because we don't really know certain areas of research because we are trying to ensure ethical research. So it's a balance that needs to be maintained. Generally, research is voluntary, so there's no need for people to it's not mandatory for them to be involved. And so that often means too that participants can back out at any point of time within the research program as well. And so because things are voluntary, it can threaten generalizability because then there may be demographics or types of people who are more likely to participate in research. For example, college educated people who have research centers on their campus are much more accessible to researchers than, say, people who don't have access to the internet or live in like particularly more rural populations as well. Generally, deceiving subjects is not considered ethical, so you can't actively lie to the people that you're trying to study. Sometimes though, you may be just more broad about what exactly you're studying, so that way you're not influencing how your participant sees your study. And generally, it's also a matter of trust building too. You don't want to actively deceive your subjects because then they may not want to work with you moving forward. And your book gives a couple examples of instances in which deceiving subjects was difficult. So if you want to look into those too, the Weideman and Chiardi study, you can. Legal liability is really important, especially in criminal justice research. So you can't fail to report observed criminal activity to the police. And it's difficult when crimes are being committed because you have to sort of report those. And so it's not like we have legal immunity in a way. So we also have to make sure that we're planning ahead and recognizing if there are instances in which we will be seeing people who are committing crimes and what we would do in that particular instance. So as I alluded to, criminal justice research is particularly difficult, especially when we're working within agencies like correctional institutions, and maybe they are having some unethical issues that are occurring. So for example, I worked at Rikers Island Jail, and during my time there, the federal government actually issued a report about how the correctional officers were like actively abusing the people there. And so if you become aware of staff misbehavior, then you're obligated to tell someone about what's going on, and that can often influence your access to that research. So maybe there might be some backlash towards you, and you have to now set up your study somewhere else because they see that they don't trust you then. And so it's difficult, but we also need to make sure that we're committing ourselves to ethical research above all. And sometimes when we want to randomize experiments and we want a control group, some people might not get access to treatment. And so that creates a difficult situation. And sometimes institutional review boards who regulate this will approve it. And sometimes they may have an alternative for you to work on. We are also, because we're attached to university, mandatory reporters. So for example, I'm doing some research with people who are released because of COVID-19. And so if they, in our interviews, ever tell me that they are a witness of either child abuse or elder abuse, like I have to tell someone, and then that interview may not be deemed confidential. And so there are certain ethical standards that you need to engage in even while you're doing research. And so the way that we practice that to ensure that things are voluntary is we give our participants a form called informed consent. And so it outlines what's required of the participants in the study, and it also lets them know what the risks and side effects and benefits they may gain. And so it's sort of like a contract of like, here's what you can expect from us, here's what we should expect from you. And there are particular subjects that need more explanation and need more stringent guidelines in regards to informed consent. So children in particular, like, need a guardian, and other sufficient forms of regulation, and people who are prisoners also need more stringent regulations in regards to research, because they have historically been more vulnerable, like they have less autonomy, they are more susceptible to abuse in these instances, and there has been a history of researchers not being super ethical in prisons. And so because of that, there was in 1974 a National Research Act, which was signed into law after a couple of really highly publicized examples of researchers doing unethical research. And in 1979, there was the Belmont Report, which was issued, and the three components are respect for persons, beneficence, and justice. So it's balancing and making sure that there's ethical standards that exist, and to make sure that the benefits of research outweigh the costs of research. And if you are going to do the extra credit of getting city certified, you'll have to make sure that you know extensively about these two reports. And a lot of the regulations that research has, it comes from these two reports. And institutional review boards are the people who implement and make sure that researchers are abiding by these regulations. And so each university, each correctional facility has their own institutional review board. So anywhere that there would be research on subjects would have an institutional review board. So sometimes you might be dealing with multiple institutional review boards, say from the prison that you want to research in, and also your university in which you're a student. And so these people sit on a committee and they make judgments about your proposal. So often you have to write a research proposal that really outlines what's the design of your study, what type of methods are using, what is the sampling population, all of these things. And they read through your proposal and give you feedback, and they'll tell you, okay, you can do this if you make this adjustment. And so they're the ones making sure that the safety, confidentiality, and general welfare of subjects is protected. And some study designs are regarded as exempt, especially if there's no apparent harm to participants. Like, for example, if you're doing a survey that's online and completely voluntary, it might be exempt from having to go through the institutional review board. But generally in criminal justice settings, you're more than likely going to have to deal with an institutional review board. So sort of stepping away from the pre-design, pre-implementation of research, when you're analyzing and reporting, you need to be really transparent about what your initial study design, your initial hypothesis was, and what your actual observed outcomes were. And there's a lot of pressure in research to sort of make sure that you have a significant finding, that you have those asterisks in your data analysis, that the P, that the P factor is small and that it is statistically significant. And so you want to make sure that even if you found in your analysis that there was nothing statistically significant, that's still something. Even if there were no findings, that support your hypothesis, you need to report that. And so it's important even to know that two things aren't related. And so no, there's never any not good findings, right? It's just us trying to get closer to the truth. So an example of a research design gone awry is the Stanford Prison Experiment, which you all may be aware of. So it tried to test two hypotheses about prisons: the dispositional hypothesis that prisons are brutal and dehumanizing because of the people in them, and then the situational hypothesis that prison environment creates brutal and dehumanizing conditions. And so this was a study done by multiple researchers in 1971, and it simulated a prison. So because it's simulating that environment, if the people within it are engaging in a way that is brutal, then they would say, okay, this is support for the situational hypothesis. But if they are not actually engaging in a way that's brutal, then it's not the people within the prison, it's the it does not support the situational hypothesis. It means that the people who work in prisons in general may have caused that brutality. And so they constructed this prison in the basement of a psychology building, and they paid their subjects $15 a day. Again, remember that these people are more likely to be college students, so that sort of influences generalizability. And they had an informed consent contract, and we're told that there would be no physical abuse that would go on during the study. Unfortunately, the study had to be terminated after 6 days because the prison guards were getting super aggressive, and the people who were the subjects and were the prisoners were actually showing really intense psychological harm that was being done to them. So 5 had to be released because they showed severe signs of depression and anxiety. And more rigorous analysis and looking back on this experiment showed that the researchers were actually influencing how the guards were engaging with the prisoners. So they were giving instructions during orientation on like how to engage. They also sort of created this power dynamic where they convinced the guards that they were research assistants and that their conclusions were pre-written for non-academic aims. So this is why it's really important, like I said in the first lecture, that your observations and your analysis are completely separate than your research design and your hypothesis. Those have to be done at 2 separate instances. They cannot be done at the same time. And this then creates a lot of bias that happens in the research setting, because you're not just putting people in a situation and saying, all right, let's see if the environment is influencing them, you're influencing them, you're presenting the error. And so this is an example of unethical research, and a lot of the reasoning why we have institutional review boards and standards for how we do research. And so this is a quote from the article that did an exploration in how this study was implemented. And a lot of this study contributed to the idea that nothing works in regards to prison reform, that we should like give up hope in this space and like really not have any type of rehabilitation in this space. And so as researchers, we have a lot of power and responsibility to make sure that the research we're presenting is actually true, because it has a lot of impact on people's lives and has the ability to affect policy and types of interventions we're planning, and really is powerful. So this is why research ethics is important.